After more than 30 seasons, Saturday Night Live is an American cultural touchstone. But 3 decades of humor have come with a hefty dose of heartbreak. We call the number 11 story on our list Tragedies from Studio 8.
Saturday Night Live is the factory that produces comedians who end up breaking out big.
What time is it? It's looking for trouble time!
Since 1975, more than 100 funny men and women have been part of the SNL cast. The early seasons of the show were famous for stories of backstage antics and drug use.
It was decadent, it was funny, it was edgy, it was strange, and all those things put together made it work.
One of the show's first breakout stars was John Belushi. From SNL's debut season in 1975, John's manic energy made him an audience favorite.
When you stepped into John's world, you're like on the bullet train. You were going 200 miles an hour.
But John's intensity as a performer was partially fueled by a real-life addiction to cocaine.
A lot of comedians are actually very introverted, dark, and deep people. Cocaine gives them the lift and the courage and the adrenaline to get out and put on a show when they may not be feeling up for it.
He carried a disease, addiction, and millions of people have them.
In 1979, after just 4 seasons, the popular comic left SNL to pursue a movie career. Leading roles in classic films like Animal House and Blues Brothers cemented his status as a comedy superstar, and Belushi lived like one.
After he left the Saturday Night Live and he was doing the movies, it was a lot less of a controlled environment. He was a lot more out on his own. He was spending a lot of that time doing things that was very unhealthy for him.
The party came to a sudden and tragic end the morning of March 5th, 1982, in a West Hollywood hotel. John's body was discovered on his bed shortly after noon. An autopsy concluded that Belushi died from a fatal dose of heroin and cocaine.
By the end, the cocaine had led to heroin, which led to a cocaine-heroin combination called a speedball that was injected right into him. The drug use just spiraled out of control and consumed him.
Belushi's overdose was just the first in a string of tragedies for some of the stars of Studio 8. In October 1986, original cast member Gilda Radner was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. Gilda succumbed to the disease 3 years later. After a dip in the ratings in the 80s, several new cast members revitalized Saturday Night Live in 1990.
Good Lord.
One of Studio 8's most memorable additions was a hefty force of nature from Wisconsin named Chris Farley.
I always like to make people laugh. It makes me feel good, you know. All of a sudden you get a laugh and it's like, oh my God.
Chris Farley was the new heavy-set comedian following in the footsteps of John Belushi, and he was just hysterical. He could just utter a line and give it an intensity to just rip right through your funny bone.
The comparison to Belushi was appropriate. Unfortunately, Chris and John shared more than just supersized comic chops. The comedian also suffered from an addiction to heroin and cocaine.
Friends and family of Chris had been worried about him. He was getting into drugs and drinking. He was a time bomb that was just gonna be going off.
In 1995, after 5 years, Farley left SNL. Films like Tommy Boy, Black Sheep, and Beverly Hills Ninja made Chris a bona fide comedy star. But no amount of fame or box office success could help Chris beat his addictions.
The problem with Chris Farley, he's mixing heroin, which is in essence a drug that causes respiratory depression. Cocaine, on the other hand, is a stimulant. And cocaine is like making your heart go into a dead sprint.
On the night of December 18, 1997, just 6 weeks after hosting SNL, Chris Farley was found dead in his Chicago apartment. Like his hero John Belushi, Farley's death was the result of a drug overdose. And, like John, Chris was just 33 when he died. Radner, Belushi, Farley. Each loss was tragic in its own way, but perhaps the most shocking death from the ranks of Saturday Night Live is Unforgettable Hollywood Tragedy number 10, the murder of Phil Hartman.
What was so appealing about Phil Hartman was he was almost the funny dad that you wanted to have.
Phil joined SNL in 1986 and stayed for 8 seasons, making him one of the longest-serving cast members in the show's history.
He was a rock for Saturday Night Live because of his ability to capture the essence of anything that he tried to do. He was a very talented comedian.
Phil seemed to live a charmed life off-screen as well. He married his beautiful wife Bryn in 1987, and together they had 2 children.
When you first meet someone, it's just full of potential and butterflies in the stomach and romance and passion and all these feelings that dominate. But sooner or later, you get into who you really are as people.
Outwardly, Phil and Bryn appeared an ideal Hollywood couple.
There was a dirty little secret that Bryn Hartman was living with, and that was her addiction to prescription and other drugs. And Mr. Hartman was very upset over this, and they argued over it.
Bryn had already been through rehab for cocaine and alcohol addiction in the 1970s, long before she met Phil. But in 1998, friends say she relapsed and began using again.
For a period of time in their marriage, she had become sober and was doing well. But I think difficulties in the marriage, her own feelings of estrangement, prompted her picking that back up.
She did abuse drugs, cocaine. She was on an antidepressant, clearly had alcohol problems.
On May 17th, around 3 a.m., something apparently snapped inside Bryn.
Bryn Hartman, at some time and after the children had gone to bed, pulled a gun out.
Under the influence of alcohol and cocaine, Bryn fired 3 shots at Phil as he slept. The comic died instantly.
The cocaine can make you paranoid, can make you feel like you're being persecuted when you're not. You can come up with all sorts of delusions and all sorts of thoughts that might not even be there.
Bryn then drove to the house of a friend, Ron Douglas, and revealed what she'd done.
Now, Douglas doesn't believe her. She's drunk, she's crazy.
He discovered that she was in the possession of a handgun. He ultimately agreed to follow her back to her residence.
When Douglas arrived at the Hartmans' Encino home, he immediately called 911.
I think there's a shooting here. Okay, do you see the victim? Yeah.
After police showed up on the scene, Bryn fled to the bedroom where Phil's body lay. As officers ushered the couple's children out the door, they heard a gunshot.
Mrs. Hartman was in bed, sitting up in bed with her back against the headboard before she had taken her own life.
At the time of Phil and Bryn's death, Bryn was reported to be on a combination of Zoloft, cocaine, and alcohol. That is a brutal mix of both stimulants and depressants. This may have contributed to what happened that night.
Phil's life came to a horrific and violent end. The reaction in Hollywood was one of shock and disbelief.
There's almost no way to really respond to something like that. Phil was a very funny man. I certainly enjoyed his company when I would see him.
Phil and Bryn were cremated and a private funeral service was held at Forest Lawn Cemetery. Per his will, Phil's ashes were scattered over the Pacific Ocean near Catalina Island. Coming up, a rock icon's mysterious disappearance. Was it a cry for help or a final farewell?
He literally scaled the wall to get out. He disappeared.